Starting with this isn't your usual, "I'm living with my parents because I can't afford rent" narrative, I would say. No, this is far more complicated. For the past year, I have been living with my parents. The twist is that I purchased the house. Paying the mortgage, covering the bills, and ensuring food is on the table falls to me. Not one penny is contributed by my parents. For background, my dad, Mike, and mother, Anne, both retired roughly 5 years ago. For most of my life, they had been living in the countryside. Then they decided they wanted a change when both of them quit working. Moving to the city would provide them more excitement and more activities, and they would be closer to me. The tranquil life wasn't really cutting it for them anymore. That is at least what they claimed. The concept appealed to me not at all. I was, after all, doing reasonably financially. As a software engineer, I have consistent employment, so I felt I might assist them. I purchased a reasonably sized 3-bedroom city house. Nothing too extravagant, but decent enough. A good-sized living room, a small backyard, and most importantly, room for all of us. Of course, I claimed the master bed. I pay the expenses. Why would I not take the room with the ensuite bathroom and walk-in closet? It simply made sense. My home office developed out of the second bedroom. Most days I work from home, so I needed a suitable arrangement, including my twin monitors, ergonomic chair, and everything in its rightful location. The third room. That was expected to be the guest room, though. At first, it appeared straightforward, just a venue for guests or relatives who might drop by. Still, it was the intended scheme. Things started off nicely at first. To be in the city delighted my folks. Gardening, binge-watching shows, and relishing retirement life, they were falling into a pattern. And I? It was hardly a big concern. I was working my job, paying the mortgage, and handling household expenses. It was not, actually. I made decent money, hence I had no trouble helping them. They reared me, after all, too. Why would I ask them to contribute or charge them rent? Then, though, arrived the turning point when things began to change. Over breakfast one morning, my mother said casually, "Your brother Matt and his girlfriend Sophie are considering city living. Things haven't been fantastic for them. With Sophie pregnant, they may really benefit from the help." I recall nodding, without really thinking about it. 27-year, Matt, and 25-year, Sophie have always seemed to have wandered from one issue to another. They were not exactly flourishing either, but they were not impoverished either. And now, with a kid on the way, their circumstances seemed a little more tenuous. Still, I thought they would settle into their own apartment, maybe a tiny one close by. I reasoned they would calm down and sort things out. My mother visited me once more a few days later. She reported more specifically this time. She said, her tone so laid back that I felt this was some small favor. "We invited Matt and Sophie to stay with us for a little while," she said, smiling, "just until they get on their feet." I simply nodded, not understanding how fast things were about to fly out of control. Looking back, I most certainly ought to have spoken right then and there, but I neglected. I asked no questions about it. I refrained from objecting. I simply assumed they would move out after a few weeks, maybe a month. Matt and Sophie arrived a week later carrying luggage. I felt something like sinking in my gut the moment I spotted them at the front entrance. They were here for the long run, not the sort of, "we're staying for a little bit." I enjoy my brother right now. Not to confuse you, is not family is family. Matt, well, he's not exactly known for making wise choices. He always finds himself in sticky circumstances, and more usually than not, someone else is helping him out. Furthermore, Sophie? She's friendly, but her entitlement around her really irritates me the wrong way. Like the world owes her, particularly now she is pregnant. I noted things were strange from the time they moved in. It was more than just the additional mouths to feed or the shopping cost increase, though, believe me, it was sufficient annoyance. No, it was the way they just seemed to settle in as though they owned the house. Their junk crept over the living room gradually. Their shoes were usually strewn all about. They seemed to have moved in, without asking questions, and they seemed to have thought they could act any way they pleased. Though I attempted to be patient, my irritation grew more pronounced the longer they stayed. Naturally, then, the comments began to flow. Sophie would say, "Wow, this place is so big," among other minor observations. At first, I brushed it off. It must be difficult to keep everything clean by yourself. We will need a lot of space when the kid arrives. But then, one night following a demanding day of work, Matt and Sophie drew me away for a talk. Their serious expressions made me wonder, well, maybe they're going to apologize for being such a burden, or at least offer to help out with the bills. Sophie started, "So we've been thinking it would make more sense for us to take the master bedroom," and I just stared at her, trying to understand what I had just heard. "We need more space," Matt said, as though that made everything quite plain. "Your room has the closet and the private bathroom. The baby will need a lot of goods. It just makes sense." I couldn't believe the boldness. I pay the loan on the house. I sort the bills. I pay for everything. Here they were, begging me to turn out my room. At first, I had no idea how to react either. I was quite surprised. At last, I managed to remark, "Why not use the guest room? It's plenty huge." Sophie was not having it. She remarked like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "But it doesn't have a walk-in closet and will need space for the baby." I inhaled deeply, attempting to cool off. "I'm not giving up my room," I answered as gently as I could. Matt looked shocked that I wasn't not simply rolling over and giving them what they wanted, but Sophie looked downright irritated. "You could take the guest room or find another place to live." I understood then that this would not be a simple discussion. So following the chat in which Matt and Sophie asked me to give up my master bedroom, I assumed they would see how illogical they were and would back off. Really, how could anyone, let alone a family, think it acceptable to expect the person covering all expenses to simply turn over their space? Naturally, though, that is not how things turned out. To put it mildly, the next several days were underlined with tension. Their behavior changed somewhat practically right away. They began to act as though they owned the area. Their things were all about. Baby mags and haphazard trash they had brought virtually dominated the living room. The day was aggravating me more and more, but I stayed silent, hoping maybe they would come to sense. I made a mistake. Usually working from home, I had to visit the office for a meeting one day. An unusual occurrence. I left for just a few hours, and when I returned, something seemed strange the second I walked in the door. I noticed several of my personal items, my clothes, shoes, even my laptop, piled up beside the wall as I walked into the corridor. My heart dropped, and I knew right away something was wrong. I hurried to my bedroom, and there Sophie was standing in the middle of my room. She was orderly packing my belongings, not showing any guilt on her face. When she spotted me stuck in surprise standing there in the doorway, she hardly flailed. She said apathetically, like it was no great issue, "Oh, hey, just finishing up moving your stuff. Your mom said we could start moving in here since, the baby will need the space." I could feel my fury boiling. They could, according to my mother, not paying a single dime toward this house, my mother felt it was acceptable to just toss my room without even consulting me. I was boiling. My voice quivering with rage, I entered the room and asked, "What the hell do you think you're doing? This is my room. As I previously mentioned, you are not living here." Sophie crossed her arms and cast me this glare, as though I were the one acting irrationally. She said, "But the guest room doesn't have enough space and there's no closet," as though that covered all. I was lacking it. "I'm not interested. I pay the loan on the house. I settle the debts. This is my home." I shot back, my voice harsher than I meant. "If you can't deal with that, then you're welcome to find somewhere else to live." I stopped caring. They had strayed from the mark. Sophie pointed at me, but I was not backing away. Turning, I rushed out of the room, snatched my phone, and dialed my mother. She picked up the second one. I hardly let her talk. "Mom, did you really tell Matt and Sophie they could occupy my room?" My voice almost trembling with incredulity, I asked. On the other end, there was a protracted silence that suggested she was startled. "Well, I thought it would be the best answer," she responded warily. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You have your workplace, and the space with the baby arriving is not like you're using it for anything. "Mom, I am paying for this house. I cover grocery expenses. I cover all costs. And you feel it's acceptable to simply turn over my room without even engaging in conversation?" I was furious. It was about respect, or the absolute absence of it, not only about the room anymore. "We're family," my mother murmured, attempting to cool me off. "You need not create such a great fuss over this. Though I wasn't buying it, we all simply wanted to be there for one another. I am not giving up my room. Should their belongings not be moved, they will have to find another place to reside." I snapped, then hung up, not playing this game anymore. By now, Sophie had stormed out of the bedroom, looking enraged, and naturally Matt arrived just in time to aggravate matters. He came in seeming annoyed and insisted on knowing what was going on. I said squarely, "What's going on is that your wife is trying to take over my room, and I'm telling you both right now it's not happening. You can go or remain in the guest room. Simple as that." Matt stared, shocked. He began venturing off about how selfish I was, how they had a kid en route, and how families should make sacrifices for one another. Still, I wasn't about let him guilt-trip me. I had been really giving, and they were profiteers. Sacrifices? I am the one making all the payments. I grabbed. "What are you helping to contribute? Not one thing, and now you believe you may simply occupy my house as you own the place. Not happening." The debate got noisy. My mom tried to step in, but I stopped listening to her since my dad remained mute. I left. Turning to Matt and Sophie, I stated, "You have till the end of the day to clear your belongings from my room. I'll move it out for you if you don't." Sophie bolted out, slammed the door behind her, and Matt just stood there staring at me like I was the evil man. But I no longer gave a damn. Given that I was the one footing the money for everything, I was not going to let them stroll all over my own house. I stayed in my office trying to cool off all through the day. I knew that if I returned out there, it would simply lead to another dispute. I could not handle them anymore. Though I was weary of the conflict and the continuous disrespect, I also knew this was not the end. They were not going to let this pass without a fight. Deep down, I knew my mother would want to get back involved. But this time I was not caving in. I got up the following morning ready for round 2. Though I had no idea what to anticipate, the place was shockingly silent. Actually, rather silent. Half expecting another argument, I entered the kitchen, but it was empty. No Matt, nothing Sophie. Not even my folks, not even. I wondered momentarily whether they had packed and left in the middle of the night. Still, I understood that was only wishful thinking. Sitting down with my coffee, I waited, fearing whatever would next come. A part of me hoped they would at last back off, that they would see how illogical they were being and choose to remain in the guest room without demanding anything else. Naturally, however, that is not what transpired. A few hours later, my mother arrived in the kitchen. At first, she said nothing, simply took a cup of coffee and settled across from me. Though at first the stillness between us was thick and uncomfortable. She finally spoke. Her voice weary, she said, "Honey, I didn't realize things had gone that terrible between you and your brother. I guess we didn't notice how unfair it was to you. We were just trying to help him out." I didn't say anything at first. I was still really irate and disappointed. Still, hearing her confess it, that she had handled me, felt like a little step in the right direction. "You didn't just discount what I wanted," I remarked softly. "You sided with them every time, like you just assumed I'd be okay with whatever they wanted." My mother groaned and looked down at her coffee. "We felt, you have always been the resilient one. Matt's never had it easy. There it was once more. The golden child, the one who always needed assistance and constant support. I was the one living with them, hence it seemed as though I had no restrictions. And you suppose I have had it easy?" I grabbed. "The one making the mortgage payments is me. It is me paying all the expenses. I am the one carrying this entire house. You wonder if I could just keep doing it indefinitely." She didn't quarrel. I had never seen her truly paying attention and attempting to grasp where I was coming from before. "We'll sort something out," she whispered softly. "But kindly, avoid pushing us out. Not like this." I back off, attempting to cool off. It was not what I intended to do, kick them out. Although they were my parents, I couldn't continue to live under conditions whereby they disregarded my limitations. Already, I would allow too much slide. "I don't want to push you out," I answered at last. but things have to change. My mother nodded and then got up and left the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I cannot continue to live like this. The quiet following that chat with my mother was heavy, but at least I sensed she was beginning to understand. Though I wasn't going to be treated like I didn't matter longer, I didn't want to drive my parents from the house. Though I had no idea what Matt and Sophie were plotting, I knew one thing. I wasn't backing down or compromising my space. Matt emerged later that day at last. He entered the living room where I was seated, his face a mirror of the same resentment and annoyance I'd been observing for days now. At first he said nothing. He just stood there, arms crossed, glaring at me as though I were the evil guy. "You actually are going to do this?" At last, his voice tinged with bitterness, he inquired, "You really will be kicking us out for a dumb room?" Looking up from my phone, I wasn't particularly astonished at how he was presenting it. "Matt, it goes beyond the room here. It comes down to respect. I have paid for everything. You and Sophie entered here as though you owned the space. You hardly asked at all. You simply expected me to roll over and supply anything you wanted. That is not the way things go." He laughed and shook his head. "We are a family. You are meant to be helpful. Man, I have a baby on order." I felt a flash of wrath spring up, but I kept my voice cool even though I didn't expect you would be that selfish. "I have been paying for groceries, this housing, bills, everything. You have contributed what? Nothing. Then you show up here trying to occupy my room. Matt, that is not self-serving. That is my setting of limits. Either stay in the guest room or go away. Those are your decisions." He pointed at me, obviously unhappy with anyone. Though he understood deep down he lacked a leg to stand on, I could sense he wanted more argument. At last, he mumbled under his breath, "Fine," and bolted from the living room alone. That was Matt's approach. He constantly blamed someone else for his mistakes, never ready to own them. I was not going to let his passive-aggressive remarks and guilt trips overwhelm me. I had marked my line and was following it. It was a peaceful day the following, quite silent. Matt and Sophie were hardly visible, and to be honest, I was not too bothered about it. Though the house was tense, at least there were few arguments. Working in my office most of the day, I sought to avoid any additional conflicts. My dad arrived in the kitchen mid-afternoon while I was quickly lunching. He said little, merely took a cup of coffee and settled at the table. Though he wasn't sure how to start, I could sense he wanted to communicate. A few quiet minutes later, he spoke at last. Quietly, barely looking up from his coffee, he remarked, "Matt and Sophie are leaving today." At first, I didn't know how to answer. Though another part of me felt conflicted, another of me felt relief. Though this was not how I wanted things to be, they had pushed me too far and I could not let them continue to stroll all over me. Not sure what to say, I nodded and kept cooking my lunch. "They have nowhere to go," my dad said softly. I stopped what I was doing and stared at him. They would be staying in a motel till they worked things out. Though another part of me realized this was the result of their deeds, another felt guilty. They hadn't respected it. I had given them time and space. They had to cope with the ramifications now. My voice firm, I added, "I didn't want it to come to this." But they left me without option. I provided them alternatives. My dad didn't object when they refused to accept them. He simply nodded and drank some coffee. He knew nothing to say, but I could see he didn't enjoy the circumstances any more than I did. Matt and Sophie were packing by the time the afternoon arrived. Not wanting to start another fight, I stayed in my office. Though I kept to myself, I could hear them moving about, the sound of boxes being hauled down the corridor, and their quiet murmurs. I wanted not to be dragged into yet another argument. Then, exactly as I had anticipated, my door knocked. When I opened it, Matt stood there with a frustrated, contorted expression. "You really are going to let this happen?" His voice loud and angry, he questioned. "You are actually kicking us out?" I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I allotted 24 hours to you. You disregarded what I told you about what was to be done. Matt, you are not being kicked out for no cause. Weeks of freeloading here between you and Sophie have gone without any contribution. I have been paying for everything. Instead of thanks, you tried to occupy my room." Matt closed his mouth and balled his hands at his sides, not willing to let that happen. "That's it, huh? You seem to be discounting us as though we are not important. I inhaled deeply and tried to keep my cool. You have the same choice I offered yesterday. You can remain in the guest room and really honor my space, or you can find somewhere of your own. If you can't do that, though, then sure, you're leaving. He looked at me for a few seconds, obviously calculating his alternatives. But I could see the resentment and irritation in his eyes. He turned at last and left without further word, leaving me standing in the doorway. By late afternoon, they were gone. I honestly didn't want to see them go. I never noticed them leaving. I was not seeking some emotional farewell or another quarrel. The house seemed different when they departed, packed their belongings, piled them into the car, and drove gone without telling me anything. Less noisy, less strained. That day my parents said not much to me. I believe they were still absorbing everything that had happened. Though she seemed unhappy, my mother stopped trying guilt-trip me or fight with me. Matt and Sophie had pushed me too far, so I believe she at last realized that I was not the one who had started all of this. My mother dropped by my door later that evening. She arrived and slumped down on the edge of my bed, her look a mix of resignation and melancholy. She remarked gently, "They're gone." I nodded, saying nothing at all. At that point, I had no idea how to feel, though another part felt this weight, like things had gotten out of control in a way I never expected. Part of me felt relief. "I never thought it would come to this," my mother said softly. I gazed at her, the frustration I had been clinging to for so long beginning to just gently lift. "I didn't realize how much pressure we were putting on you," I said. "It's not that I didn't want to help. You guys treated me like I didn't matter, like my needs had little bearing, and I could not continue to live like that." She sighed and nodded gently. "You were right. We should have recognized it sooner." We sat silently for a few minutes, the weight of the matter at last resting between us. She was clearly agitated, but at least now she could see where I was coming from. After some time, "I don't want you and Dad to leave," I said. "But if things don't change, I can't live like this." She nodded once more, getting to her feet carefully. "We'll sort it out," she murmured softly. "Things will be different," she said as she walked out of the room. I had an odd mix of relief and tiredness. Although the matter with Matt and Sophie was resolved, my parents still needed work done. At least, right now, they appeared ready to listen. I thought I could at last breathe once more, for the first time in weeks. The strain hovering over the house was gone. Though it was not the ideal fix, at least now I had my space back. More importantly, I still respected you. Strangely peaceful were the short days Matt and Sophie left. The house seemed emptier, quieter, and quite honestly, a great relief. Until it vanished, I had not realized how much the stress was hanging on me. I could enter the kitchen for the first time in weeks without feeling as though I would be ready to be pulled into another quarrel or passive-aggressive exchange. My parents seemed to be especially quiet. Though they spoke nothing about Matt and Sophie leaving, I could tell it hurt them. At first, my mother appeared a little lost, like she didn't really know what to do with herself. She would enter a room, look around, and then silently return to her regular TV or gardening schedule. My dad was seated outside in the backyard, drinking his coffee one morning. When I joined him, he glanced up, but initially we said nothing. We just sat there in peace, allowing the stillness of the dawn to surround us. It was calm, something the house had not seen in some time. He spoke finally, his voice gentle and introspective. "You did what you had to do." Startled by the statement, I watched him. Hearing my dad say felt like a weight being lifted, as he is not one for lengthy talks, particularly not about emotions or family strife. I remarked, sipping my own coffee, "I didn't want it to get this bad." Still, they gave me little option. He nodded gently, looking out into the yard. They were abusing it. Matt has always been challenges. We seem to have helped him too much as well. I valued your candor. Perhaps we were unaware of how much we were damaging you along the process. Though it was subtle, my dad's humble admission of the circumstances meant a lot. For the first time, They seemed truly beginning to get what I had been dealing with. Indeed, I answered, keeping my voice steady. You wanted to help them, I understand. To me, though, it seemed unfair. We stayed there for a while more, neither of us saying anything, but the silence was not awkward. I cannot carry everyone. Things would be different moving forward, almost like an unwritten understanding. A few days later, I observed little adjustments about the residence. After Matt and Sophie went, my mother, who had been detached and a touch erratic, started picking up her old interests once more. She was more often in the garden. Occasionally, I would hear her humming to herself as she worked. Also seeming to be more laid back was my dad. He would read or watch his shows, free from the stress hovering over him. And about me? I thought I could at last breathe. I was able to resume my schedule without worrying as though someone might cause havoc with it. Once more, my home office became my haven. I could sit at my computer and concentrate on work free from outside interruptions. Still, I sensed things weren't quite healed, even with the peace returning. My mom brought it up one evening as we were seated for dinner. Just me, Dad, and her. Do you suppose Matt and Sophie will be all right? Her voice laced with anxiety as she asked. I laid down my fork and considered for a moment. I answered sincerely, I hope so. They must, however, solve problems on their own. She nodded, obviously still bothered about them, but she refrained from pressing the matter since I cannot cure everything for them. She seemed to struggle to believe that Matt and Sophie had to face the fallout from their deeds. She's always the kind to try and mend things and make sure everyone is taken care of. But this time, it wasn't her place. Things then came to rest in a new normal. There were no more unwritten expectations hanging in the air. My folks respected my space. They appeared to understand that they couldn't simply ignore me or expect me to manage everything without thinking through how it impacted me. Though it was a small adjustment, it made all the difference. Regarding Matt and Sophie, I heard very little from them for some time. Seeking their next action, I assumed they were still lodging at the motel, my dad stated. Though a larger portion of me knew it was necessary, part of me felt guilty for them. They had to come to terms with the fact that they couldn't keep depending on everyone else to solve their problems. A few weeks went by and Matt texted me. Like he knew he had to, it was brief and direct, unlike his actual inclination to reach out. Purchased an apartment? Sophie is okay, just wanted to let you know. I debated how to reply for some time looking at the post. At least not in the same manner. I was not upset anymore. However, I was not ready to act as though everything was good either. At last, I responded via SMS. Good to hear your performance is improving. Take care. That was it. Not long chat, not apologies, but it was sufficient. In one sense, it was closure. They were continuing. And so was I. Ultimately, this whole scenario made me stand up for myself in a manner I had not done before. Though I had always been the one keeping everything together and ensuring everyone else was fine, I came to see that I could not continue to put my own well-being last for others, especially when they did not treat me in turn. Though things had changed, living with my parents was not ideal. Now there was more mutual respect, and my set of boundaries was being followed. Another Matt and Sophie scenario reoccurring scared me nothing. I had learned to stand up, say no when I had to, and put myself first when it counted. Really, I liked the house to be quieter. Having my space back physically and psychologically brought peace that appealed to me. It felt like things were at last under control as my parents and I were discovering a new rhythm for the first time in a long time. When I did at last breathe, it felt absolutely fantastic.